Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal and Other Acts Amendment, Federal Jurisdiction and Other Matters Bill 2021. And this main purpose of this bill is to amend the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal Act 1998 regarding matters relating to federal or interstate jurisdictions that currently cannot be dealt with or heard in Victoria and makes consequential amendments to the Magistrates Court Act of 1989, County Court Act of 1958, the Supreme Court Act of 1986 and the Civil Procedures Act of 2010. The bill also has some changes to the County Court Act of 1958 and the Judicial Entitlements Act of 2015 to create the Office of Deputy Chief Judge of the County Court and amend the Public Prosecutions Act of 1994 in relation to the appointment of an acting Chief Crown Prosecutor and for other consequential amendments from creating the Office of Deputy Chief Judge of the County Court. But I'm actually going to focus on the parts of the bill, the main provisions of the bill, where the primary aim is to address the jurisdictional gap that the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, the Tribunal or VCAT, cannot currently hear cases involving federal or interstate jurisdictional matters because under the Constitution it is not as a recognised court. And the bill creates a regime for such federal and interstate cases that would, because of their nature, normally be considered by VCAT to be dealt with by the Magistrates Court. Now, I have already stated in a contribution earlier today that as a border MP, the arbitrary line that exists between my electorate in South West Coast and South Australia is a line that has caused major challenge, particularly in the last 2 years, with the COVID restrictions that both Victorian government and South Australian government have imposed on the people who don't see anything when they cross the line other than a sign. Oh, well, actually there are a few pretty big giveaways, and one of those is the state of our roads. When you head into South Australia, there isn't a single person who doesn't note that the roads actually are amazingly improved than what they see in my electorate, unfortunately, because as people well know, the further you get away from Melbourne, the worse our roads get. And then you hit that South Australian border and magically they become much improved, despite the least people in the state of South Australia. The South Australian government obviously do a much better job with their roads. But that's not what I'm here to discuss, although it would be good to just make note once again that the roads could be given an injection of funding in my electorate just to help us out a considerable amount. But the reason I wanted to talk about the borders is because last year the case that highlights the importance of why this legislation is important, and we're not opposing this legislation, which is because it does need to happen. I had a constituent call me and they have a house in a town in my electorate and they had moved interstate and they'd rented out the property. They rang me because they couldn't do anything about the situation that had evolved, and the person who was renting the property had fallen into significant arrears and was owing the people over $8,000, I think it was in the end, and had done a considerable amount of damage to the property. And this was their home that they'd moved away for work purposes, from what I understand from my memory. Now, they rang me to say, we can't do anything because VCAT can't hear the case because we don't have an address in Victoria. Now, they were so distressed. These were people who, average people working hard, and just their home that they had rented out so they could move for work purposes was being, held to ransom, was how they felt it was at the time. I remember the lady being so terribly, terribly distressed. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Minister Hennessy at the time, who's in the chamber today, and pointed out to her that we really did need to address this, that these people were left without access to justice. So they were just amazed, and so was I actually, to find that they couldn't do a thing. Now, I've actually just recently been in touch with them again when I saw that the legislation that we had called for and spoke to the Minister about the need for had been actually introduced into the Parliament with the first reading, and so I spoke to them and they told me that they'd moved back to the town 5 months ago, still couldn't get access to their own home, and the case went to VCAT last week and they were given full the person has to pay back the whole amount of the $8,000 owed to them in rent arrears, and they retain the bonds, so they hopefully will be able to repair the damage. I'm sure that won't cover it though. So you can see an example like that. These real life examples that exist when you're on borders that make no sense. I'm sure when they moved into whatever state they moved into, I can't remember, they didn't think for a minute that they gave up their right to be able to have access to justice. So this bill does right that wrong, and hence we won't be opposing. But we saw last year so many challenges with the borders, and so I take this opportunity to urge the government to have a think sometimes outside the tram tracks, and how we in South West Coast, for instance, are terribly affected when these changes come in that haven't considered the challenge of a cross-border community. Like the member for Lowan said, who's also been a very fierce advocate, we have really been left in some very compromising positions where children can't get to school because a school bus can't pick them up. And I too take this opportunity to thank Luke Wilson, the Cross-Border Commissioner, who has been always there. In fact, he just texted me just before to let me know the changes that will take place for South Australia easing restrictions, which is very good news, where people won't be isolating prior to the result of their COVID tests coming through. So I take this opportunity to say, the border communities have had their fair share of challenges, much more often than people realised. I had the owner of the shop who lived on one side of the border and had his business on the other side. He was the man who did the mail for the town. He was the man who made sure there was milk and bread. He sold the bait because the government shut down the bait shed, actually, because they couldn't get through the processes and red tape. But, red tape is something that we've got to try and stop being so onerous. And I think one of the concerns we do have with this bill is maybe the lack of resources that have been put in place to cope with the backlog that will have occurred, probably mainly because of COVID as well. Today I had 3 people who can't get their working with children's check, and that's actually a lot in the last week or so. And I wonder, now that we've got the situation that we have to have people who are working with the NDIS scheme, if they're working for an NDIS provider, they must have a clearance of the working with children check, with the clearance to be a NDIS worker. And I'm just wondering if this is another case where the Attorney General's office has just not got the resources to cope with that extra workload, and whether these working with children checks that I'm being called about are backlogged and simply because the government can't manage to resource something that when they make a change, they're so busy trying to get a headline rather than actually put the processes in place to make it happen. The gentleman that I spoke with, or my office spoke with over the last couple of days, he's going to be without a wage for the next 6 weeks. He works in a local school, and the school rang me today saying, he's not going to have a wage for 6 weeks because they said it would take 15 days, and he's rang me I think after about 2.5 weeks, and that was last week, and today they phoned me to say he's told another 6 weeks. So they can't have him on the premise without his working with children check, and the 15-day KPI that I think the government must set when he looked up the website is well and truly overdue if he's got to wait another 6 weeks. But also the woman who rang my office today saying she also needs to renew her working with children check and goes on the website and nothing works. She can't put a name in, she can't put a date of birth in, she can't put her address in. This is not good enough. When we put processes in place, they must have the capability in the departments to actually ensure that people are able to comply with the regulations that the government sets. But, VCAT does provide us those opportunities that we do look for, and at the moment, not long ago when the Lookout, a very important drug and alcohol rehabilitation project, was looking for a site, VCAT made a rule that they were able to set up in Warrnambool. That's great news. Now we're just waiting for the government to give the funding, and given we all know the challenges that COVID has put our state under and the mental health challenges which often do result in drug and alcohol addictions, we never more than ever need a rehab centre in Warrnambool. So I hope the government will consider that as an important promise to the people of Warrnambool that they can rehab at home. And I will not oppose the bill.